170919, amending Chapter 68 Code of Ordinance entitled Taxation by enacting a new Section 68-450 to extend for 20 years the city's current 1% sales tax used for capital improvements and to codify dedication of the available annual sales tax receipt with 35% for neighborhood conservation, maintenance, and improvements divide equally among council districts and 65% for capital improvement, with at least 25% for street resurfacing, repair, and the construction of complete street facilities, reaffirming the role of the Public Improvements Advisory Committee, providing for submission of this ordinance to the qualified voters of the city for their approval in an election called for Tuesday, April 3rd, 2018, authorizing and directing the city clerk to notify the responsible election authorities of this election, authorizing and directing the city clerk to notify the Missouri Director of Revenue if the proposal is approved by the voters, and recognizing this ordinance as having an accelerated effect.
Thank you. And for those in the audience and watching at home, this, I believe, is our third or fourth discussion on this particular ordinance, and I think we have, in many respects, sufficiently talked through the ordinance in its original form as far as what the PIAC ordinance is, what it is paid for, the length that we are looking for, and those things. Today, and especially through the committee substitute that we introduced last week, really taking a deeper dive as far as the addition of the Buck O'Neill Bridge as a part of this piece that would go to the voters, and we have a number of speakers who are here, and which is why I wanted to bring this forward in our agenda today, just to be cognizant of their time. With that, Mr. Landis has grabbed a chair. He both broke and fixed the microphone, all in the course of that discussion. So, Mr. Landis, go right ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So in the space of the amount of time we've talked about this, I think this will be our third committee sub that we haven't introduced quite yet. I think we got it right. All right. So last week when we spoke about this issue, we added the Buck O'Neill Bridge to the mix of what was going to be a pretty straightforward renewal of our 1% capital improvement sales tax. And just reminding everybody, that's the sales tax we use to repair, replace streets, bridges, sidewalks, all those kinds of things. And also it funds the Public Improvements Advisory Committee, which we provide 35% of the tax of the $80 million on gross basis for neighborhood public improvements. What we did with the committee sub, and there is a black line version attached, is we've moved some things around, and taking in comments from the committee, specifically Councilman McManus, we made some changes in the language relative to Buck O'Neill Bridge. And just for the audience, I'll read what we have here more or less. It's a 1% sales tax, 35% of the total sales tax, the available tax after things like TIF reimbursements that will be available for neighborhood conservation. And then after that, the manager asked that we, to again improve clarity, reorder the allocation for streets. In this case, we're talking about street resurfacing, repair, construction of complete street facilities. So we have moved that up in the language. So now you have the total, then you have 35% coming off the top for the neighborhoods, and then you have 25% coming off the top for streets. And that makes a difference in the language because it changes the amount of dollars that might be available for street repairs, resurfacing, et cetera. So instead of a share of what's left after neighborhood, you have a share off the top available specifically for streets. So that's a larger allocation. I think it's clearer language within the ballot. And then the remaining part, which you're going to talk about today, and it says, and the remainder, which now if you've taken 35 and 20, you have how much left?
45.
Thank you very much.
Is this a test?
I'm just seeing if you're awake.
I'm always awake.
It's available for other capital improvements, and now the language says, including the city's share of the cost for the replacement of the Buck O'Neill Bridge. So last time we presented this, we talked about a specific dollar amount. We talked about it as a sub-allocation to a 65%. So I think we've kind of cleared the language, made it a lot simpler to understand, and doesn't lock this into any particular outcome. So that's the sub in front of you. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer. Otherwise, I'll get out of the way.
Any questions for Mr. Landis? Councilman McManus.
I think this is a great improvement. It wasn't like especially problematic to me, but I just had a little bit of clarity concerns. I just think this is a little bit more clear. So
Good.
I really appreciate you kind of taking the time to look at this, and I think it will help with the voters. I think it will also help with as we talk to our federal and state partners. So I appreciate it.
Good. All right, thank you.
Very good, thank you. And I'm going to ask, I was going to ask Wes Minder and Ron Acapole to come up next to kind of get into the meat of the presentation. But as this is the end of your blowout, that means you have to have guest stars, which one of our guest stars today is Mayor David Slater from the city of Pleasant Valley. I know that he has a time commitment that he needs to get to, so I may pull some privilege. Because you're a mayor and those two are not.
That's right.
So I thought if you wanted to say something quick to the committee, Mayor, now would be a great time. So.
Get in within half an hour. First of all, I'm sorry I have to be here today because we're talking about a Kansas City bridge, a bridge that's in Kansas City, that's a MoDOT bridge. And if the legislature would have funded this thing, we wouldn't be here. Okay, but I want to talk about regionalism. I'm the mayor of Pleasant Valley, as Councilman Wagner said, but I also chair the Metro Mayor's Caucus, so it's my job to build regionalism. And you have received regionalism on this. You've got the mayors. When this first came out, we have what's called Surface Transportation Program funding, and it's about $35 million every 2 years. And I asked for 6 years of this funding to get them a little bit softened up, but we settled on 4. And what's going to be is $40 million of money, 13 of which usually comes to Kansas City each year, so 26. So the other areas are giving up basically $14 million over this 4-year period because we believe in regionalism. To shut that bridge down for 2 years is ridiculous. And to everybody sees this as an issue that we want to pitch in on. We're hammering the legislators harder than ever. I know we had a meeting Monday where I invite the mayors, the reps and the senators, and for 45 minutes we went on them about we need this thing fixed. I don't care how they fix it, but they need to fund their biggest asset. It's just ridiculous. So anyway, MoDOT committed $50 million to your O'Neill Bridge. That means $150 million has to come from other places. And yes, it's sad that the Kansas City voters have to ante up and do this, but it's coming from a region too. That extra $50 million that MoDOT will kick in as a matching fund, that's coming out repairs that could be going to Pleasant Valley or Liberty, Independence, Raytown. But those folks all understand this, and so we want you to do this, and to use your tax is that's a burden on Kansas City, but we all pay into it. It's a regional tax too, and so I don't want to make it dangerous that this would never ever be voted back in by the people because it's huge. You guys have a huge risk here, but it needs to get done. People need to understand it's a regional issue, and that we need to make sure we have a legislature that understands that they need to fund their assets. Questions?
Thank you, Mayor. Any questions of Mayor Slater?
I'm going back to my regulators, and that'd be a whole lot more fun to sit here, but thanks for letting me bug out. Bank regulating, it's just a joy. I can't, every 18 months, I just look forward to it.
Well, you are welcome to come back on any given day and remind us whether or not you would have more fun here or there. So, but thank you for being here this morning, and thank you for your hard work on this project.
Yeah, well, it's about building regionalism, and we've done that, and hopefully we can continue that.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you. Down your legislators till they get it.
We'll work on them next. A Merry Christmas, and we'll bring forward Mr. Minder, Mr. Acapole, and as they get situated, as many of you know, Ron Acapole is with Mid-America Regional Council, part of the transportation element, if you will, of that organization, has been a part of many of these conversations, and as a reminder to the committee and to the public, we have had various conversations as to the proper or best way to fund that remaining gap that we have. That's usually fallen under the under two camps, either a taxing option or a tolling option. I think Mr. Ackerpool today has a lot of that tolling information for the committee that we're able to go through. And, of course, Mr. Minder has been working on this project almost since its inception, even going back to the Pell study that was done as part of the Beyond the Loop effort. So, gentlemen, we'll turn it over to you next and let you report however you desire.
Good morning, Chairman Wagner, members of the committee, Wes Minder, City Manager's Office. Just to recap where we are, it's been almost 10 months or so since, it's been about a year since we've started the Planning and Environmental Linkages Study, which looked at the US 169 Buck O'Neill Bridge crossing and then also was looking at the downtown freeway loop. That process and study is currently underway, and we anticipate that we'll probably get it wrapped up and have some information to present to the public this spring. But during the course of that, MoDOT, during their regular maintenance and inspections of the Buck O'Neill Bridge, had found out that its condition was a lot worse than what had been anticipated, and they had programmed a $50 million repair, which would close the bridge down for 2 years and spend $50 million to do a 30-year repair on the bridge. Since then, through numerous council actions and other presentations, we've kind of given updates on that. But right now, the way the situation sits as far as funding, the new bridge is estimated to cost approximately $200 million. MoDOT has agreed to fund $100 million of that because if they were to just replace the existing bridge in its current location where it is, it would be $100 million. And then we've also approached and received approval from the Mid-America Regional Council through the Surface Transportation Program Committee and the Total Transportation Policy Committee and the MARC Board, a commitment of $40 million over the next 4 years. So it's $40 million total over a 4-year or 2-cycle period through the Federal Surface Transportation Grant Program that would come off the top towards this project because of its regional significance, and which gives us a total identified funding of $140 million for the project. We have also we have representatives from Kit Bond Strategies here who have been working on assisting us with funding on this. There's the Federal Infra, INFRA, Infra Grant Program, which is a $1.5 billion nationwide competitive grant program. We've asked for the $60 million that we're short through that program, and we don't know what the status is as far as the United States Department of Transportation and their determination of what projects they're going to fund, but it's a very competitive program. And then there's also the Tiger Grant Program, which is capped at $25 million for application, which we've applied for, but it is only $500 million nationwide. And again, the U.S. Department of Transportation has not determined or given any indication on when they're going to select this. So we've applied for those two grants, and we're not sure exactly where we stand on those or what the timeline is on those. So that's where we are as far as identifying other sources of funds for this project. And with that, I'll be happy to answer any questions, or Ron can kind of give us an overview of what we found during our investigation on tolling options.
Why don't we go ahead and turn it over to Ron, and then that way we can have some combined questions at the end.
That'd be great. I have a few slides for my presentation, if we can get those up on the screen. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for having me over today. Ron Ackerpool, I'm the Director of Transportation and Environment for the Mid-America Regional Council. And I'll say that the replacement of the Buck O'Neill Bridge has been a long-standing priority for MARC. It's a part of the region's metropolitan transportation plan. It was a high priority for us several years ago when we were working with the state on Amendment 7 at the time for new revenues for the state of Missouri. And so this has been an initiative that we've been interested in for quite a while. We've been involved in the, as Wes said, in the Planning Environmental Linkages Study. And over the last couple of months, our executive committee and other members of the community have been interested in doing some research on how to fund the gap that we have for this project. We've done some really preliminary look at what may be available in terms of tolling as a piece of the financing or funding puzzle for this project, and so I did want to share some of that information with you this morning. If I can get those up on the screen.
Got it.
So once again, just to reiterate, at this point in the Pell study, we're working on an estimate of $200 million for the replacement of the bridge, and MoDOT is has tentatively committed up to $100 million of that. There's $50 million that was originally identified for a repair project that is now being put up as a potential part of the funding for their half of the project. As has been said, Mark has recently committed $40 million of the Surface Transportation Program funds that come to the region, which leaves a gap of $60 million. We can move on to the next slide. So what I wanted to cover was what is possible in terms of tolling for transportation projects in Missouri. We've had some conversations with tolling experts nationally and in the region. Wanted to share what some of the key considerations are if tolling is an option that folks want to pursue for this project. One of the key issues is the amount of study that's needed to be done to really determine the viability of tolling. There's quite a bit of technical and financial analysis that's needed. We have done some very rough calculations in an illustrative scenario to kind of depict what we think might be a reasonable amount of revenue that tolling might generate on this bridge, and then some of the key conclusions. And maybe I'll just not bury the lead and offer the key conclusions. Our analysis shows that we think that tolling could be part of the funding solution, but certainly would not finance the entire cost of the project. That given state law, use of tolls on this project would really complicate MoDOT's ability to contribute funds to the project. It would limit their ability to do that, and that it will take a lot of work to really figure out if tolling is in fact a viable strategy for this. So what I'm going to share with you today is by no means a conclusive answer to that question, but does set some of the parameters that we want to look at. If we could move on to the next slide. In Missouri, local governments, transportation corporations, transportation development districts can all construct bridges as toll bridges. There's also provisions that allow the Missouri Highway and Transportation Commission to contribute up to 30% of the cost for a toll bridge on the state system, but really no more than that. Recently, in the last legislative session, there was a rider placed on the appropriations bill for the state that prohibits MoDOT and the Commission from considering tolling on interstate facilities. So the political climate in Jefferson City, at least last year, was pretty adverse to tolling. And in conversations with MoDOT staff and leadership, they're not in a position to offer any financial support for any tolling studies at this point in time. We could move on to the next slide. So some of the folks that we've consulted with, we had brought in some experts for a public-private partnership workshop over the summer from KPMG in Chicago. We've got experts on the team that's working on the Pell, the Burns and McDonnell team that we've talked with. We've had conversations with MoDOT's finance folks and done quite a bit of just online research about tolling in other parts of the country. And that's sort of what is flavoring the rest of the comments here. If we could move on. So every place that has used tolling as a roadway or bridge funding option really uses tolling as a revenue generation tool and then pairs it with a financing tool. And in order to really be able to sell any kind of bonds or financing instruments based on tolls, there's quite a bit of detailed study that's needed. Generally starts with a very conceptual level and then goes on and on to a much more detailed technical analysis. These estimates that we've talked with folks about, these studies have ranged from $1 million to $2 million plus, depending on the complexity of the study. They typically take some time too, about a 12-month to 18-month to 2-year plus study is pretty typical. So there's an investment that's needed beyond what we've got currently set up in terms of the current planning studies that we're doing for the project. Some of the key things that these tolling studies will look at are the elasticity. If you charge a toll, some folks will elect not to pay it. And in a case like the Buck O'Neill Bridge, where there are other options nearby, that more people may do that in this situation than in others. And so one of the key things that you do in a tolling study is try to make learn some bounds around how much traffic may be diverted at various levels of tolling. And that requires doing public opinion surveys and quite a bit of other technical modeling work. If could go back, there's a couple of other considerations as
couple of
well.
slides.
You also get into the kind of issues of the coverage ratios you need to issue the bonds, the terms that you could sell them under, and these tolling studies also take into account more kind of a deeper dive into the legal issues and some political issues as well involved with tolling. So if we can move on to the illustrative scenario that we worked with, once again, we talked with these experts I mentioned to try and see if there's a laugh test about the assumptions that we made in this kind of illustrative analysis, and the diversion rates that kind of drive the financing seemed reasonable. We aren't assuring that these are what they would actually be, but this was a reasonable range of around 35% to up to 70% of the traffic that would otherwise use this bridge might not if a toll were applied. And we tested tolls ranging from 75 cents to $1.75 a trip one way across. We assumed a 1.5 coverage ratio, a 3% interest rate, assumed that there would be some cost to administer the tolls, to collect them, and to pursue folks that may not pay it or violate it at around 25%. And we assumed that the tolling would be set up as an open road type of an operation, that we wouldn't be constructing toll booths that folks would toss a coin in, that it would be folks would either use a tag or be billed after they use the bridge. With our analysis, we thought that a range of around $63 to $100 million might be possible. So once again, that would not cover the full $200 million cost of the project. So I'll just conclude and restate the kind of key conclusions that we drew from this, and that is that if tolls were to be used for this project, it wouldn't fund the whole thing. That given that 30% maximum contribution from MoDOT, it would seriously reduce the amount of state funds that could be applied to the bridge, and the really final decision about that would only be able to be made after doing considerable analysis that would take time and money. So that's the punchline of the work we've done over the last few weeks looking at tolling.
Very good. Any questions from committee on the tolling option or any background questions for Mr. Minder? Very clear and succinct. Did you want to add something?
I will plug the beyondtheloopkc.com study site for the Pell study, which does have survey in all of our materials. So I just would be remiss if I did not take the opportunity to plug that once again.
No, understood. Thank you both. I might call Mr. Roney to come forward, Matt Roney from Kit Bond Strategies. As Mr. Minder reminded us, we had, thanks to this council, made applications for both Tiger grants and infra grants related to the Buck O'Neill Bridge. And so I asked Matt to come just to kind of talk a little bit about both of those grant opportunities and probably even more importantly, the importance of figuring out a funding plan
Right.
And its role in attracting those grants. So take it away.
You bet. Good morning. Matt Roney, Kit Bond Strategies. Members of the committee, thank you for having me. Wes covered a lot of the ground, but...
Because you're still going to bill us. No, I'm kidding, of course.
No. As a strategy on funding for the Buck O'Neill, we've looked at the two major pots of money, the two federal grant opportunities available, which, as Wes mentioned, were infra and Tiger. And we have attacked both those applications with ferocity. We have asked for the full amount, and as we have discussed, and I think the main point today that was asked is about what we can do to put ourselves in a position that puts us in a position to be successful. There is no guarantee. It is extremely competitive. The pots of money available on a competitive basis have shrunk. I mean, it's $1.5 billion for infra and $500 million for Tiger. And we have competition. And one of the differentiators is local match, the availability of local match, to make the commitment that is, we have the local match. If we are awarded, we have the local match available, which also delivers on timing, so that if the grant is awarded, that the project is going to go forward and go forward in a timely manner. This is the exact model we used for the original Tiger grant on streetcar, and one that I would say we would, the case that we would like to make as we ask our congressional delegation to make, to advocate for us on this project. Again, as I mentioned, the competition is tough. And one of the things that we've asked, I try to operate by whatever Sheila Tracy says we should do, I do.
Many
right?
people do that, by the way.
And so, but we originally asked MoDOT to be the sponsor of the infra grant, and they refused. They have their own application, and I think that's something we ought to be aware of. They have an I-70. It's a fine project. It's an I-70 project, but it highlights the kind of competition that we're going to have. We are the sponsor, right? Which is fine. But that's just one instance of a local competitor on infra. So anything we can do to make our case and strengthen our case is something we would obviously recommend.
Quick question for you, and I'll open it up for the committee if they have others. And I've been looking at this from the standpoint of what's your maximum exposure, what's your minimum exposure if we go through PIAC as the means to do our local match. Obviously, the maximum is $60 million because that's what we presently have as our gap. But Matt, would you speak to what would be expected that the city or just the local match would have to be if we are successful in getting one or both of these grants?
So real quick, we have asked for $25 million for Tiger, $60 million for infra. So those are the two. This will be a discussion with MoDOT as well. An answer would be probably the worst case scenario would be 60, and that would be by far the worst case scenario to meet because neither of these were successful. I mean, and that's and hopefully what we would see is MoDOT maintain their commitment of $100 million if we were to be successful on our $60 million infra grant, and maybe then that would reduce to very little, because the work that you have done and that Mid-America Regional Council and the Mayor's Coalition has done to promote regionalism, I don't think it should be, I know we're all tight on time, but getting that kind of commitment from our partners in the community is remarkable. And so that's really good work and will help us make the case because, we're going to Congressman Cleaver, Congressman Graves, Senator McCaskill, Senator Blunt, and having that kind of regional support makes it easier for them to advocate for us as well. So,
very good. Any questions of Mr. Roney from committee? Councilman McManus. Yeah.
Matt, this may be outside your scope or what you're ready to testify today, but what's the kind of timeline for these grants and kind of how does that flow and match up with what we've heard from the other
great
sources?
question. One we've asked a lot of. It probably, do not hold me to this, but I would say the first of the year, January, February timeline is what it looks like. And I'll turn to Wes and see if have you heard? It's in flux. As we know, everything at the federal government is always usually a little slower. But it does, they've kind of indicated we have, kind of right after what I'd say the first quarter of the year. And I would mention that, there are there's a lot of talk in Congress of an infrastructure plan. Something we're continuing to work with our members to see where that goes and to see if there's other opportunities that come about. So just because we've applied for these two doesn't mean that that's the only thing that we're going to do. And I would be remiss, because I know it's been a priority of everybody here, is our congressional delegation, led by Congressman Graves, protected the private activity bonds. And I think that should be mentioned. That is a major, major success, and one that we should at least acknowledge. So,
Thank you.
Absolutely. Anything else?
Just appreciate your work. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, and I think the question speaks to the idea that the sooner you can bring certainty to what the local match can be, the greater the opportunity is to take advantage of those opportunities, whether they're the ones we've presently identified or anything else comes down the pike. So,
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
So-
Okay. Any other questions for Mr. Roney? Thank you,
Thank
Matt,
you.
very much.
Thanks a
for
lot.
being here. I note that Shelley Daniel from MoDOT is here. Shelley, I don't know if there's anything related to MoDOT you would like to speak to this morning, or if I shouldn't have outed you. I'm not quite sure which. I'll invite you to come forward, and if there's anything you wish to speak to, or I can provide opportunities for questions from this group, that's great too. You're one of those special guests that every blowout committee meeting needs to have. So welcome.
Well, thank you, Chairman Wagner, Councilwoman, Council, for the opportunity to come down here for MoDOT just to answer any questions. I didn't prepare anything, but I was asked by Chairman Wagner to be here in case there were questions.
Any questions, MoDOT? You got off so lucky. But thank you. Actually, I should take the opportunity to thank you, Shelley, Brian Kidwell, the district engineer, and others at MoDOT who have been very helpful in our discussion to get to where we are today. So I will at least publicly thank you and them for that help and work.
Yeah, thank you also for the continued partnership.
Absolutely. Okay. I did not have any other speakers scheduled, which is probably a relief to the committee, but I will open it up for any discussions, or we can go to public testimony if you would care to.
I'm fine to go to public
All right, we'll go to public testimony. The first card, and the only other card I have, is from Ed Ford. Good morning.
Good morning.
Mr. Councilman, and I assume you took the opportunity to entertain everyone well while we were in closed session earlier.
I had such a good time here last week, I wanted to come back on that. I'm here wearing two hats. I am the Government Affairs Chair of the Northland Chamber, and although I'm going to talk to Sheila about changing the title, that seems to get a lot of people in trouble.
Yeah.
And also as co-chair of the Ad Hoc Bridge Committee, which is made up of not only the Northland Chamber, Platte EDC, Greater Chamber, MARC, MoDOT, AFL-CIO, Heavies, Downtown Council, City of Kansas City, Forward Kansas City, the Mayor's Caucus, Riverside, other civic organizations. Bill Dietrich co-chairs that with me. I want to thank Mayor Slater for testifying today. When you think of Christmas time and bank examiners, you think of George Bailey, and so we wish him luck on that. Later today, I am going to be speaking to the Kansas City caucus of the Missouri legislature, and again, bring home the point I made last week that we are looking under every rock to try and identify the $60 million, because it is basically a MoDOT obligation, and MoDOT should be funded by the state. But as you heard from Matt Roney, we're zealously pursuing federal grants, and so we're coming to the city not as a last resort, but as a possible resort. The 2 points I want to make today, so I don't repeat myself from last week, is when you look at this sales tax, this 1 cent sales tax, it's paid for not only by residents of Kansas City, but by residents of surrounding communities. So the fact that a small part of this money may go to a MoDOT project as opposed to a Kansas City project, that's probably not inappropriate. And I don't know what that breakdown is, if it's 40%, but it's a large percentage of the sales tax is generated by non-residents of Kansas City. And the second point is most of our citizens do not follow government closely enough to know whether this bridge is funded by MoDOT, the county, the city. They just want to be able to get to work safely, get to downtown, get to the Northland. And I'm just, we're talking about 40,000 vehicles a day, and I'm just thinking that if we are unable to add this to the PIAC list and we're not able to get the funds from any other source, and we're stuck with rehabbing that bridge and closing it for 2 years, I'm thinking of all our citizens who said we gave the city $800 million on a bond issue. We renewed a 1 cent sales tax, bringing $80 million for 20 years, and they couldn't find the money to help us with the bridge repair. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions. Sheila Tracy is with us today, and we have run this by our board of directors, our executive committee, the planning and development committee, and they all enthusiastically endorse the addition of the bridge to the PIAC.
Very well. Thank you very much. And thanks for your work and continued advocacy on this project. All kidding aside, we wouldn't be where we're at without your help.
Oh, well, thank you.
Any questions of Councilman Ford from the committee? Thank you. Thank you. I'll open it up to any further public testimony on Ordinance 170919 or committee substitute for Ordinance 170919, if there is any. Sheila, you came all this way.
What he said.
What he said? All right. Best darn public testimony I've heard today. Thank you very much. If there's no one else, then I will bring it back to the committee for discussion. Councilman McManus.
This is really small, but since I was the one that asked for some changes to this, I just might point out on page 4, there's at the end of the voter language that's going to be on the ballot. I think there's an extraneous and after Buck O'Neill Bridge and question mark. So I think it's just a small typo that just needs to be corrected. But otherwise, I just want to reiterate, I appreciate Randy and legal working to just revise this a little bit, just so it's a little bit more clear. I think it will help us when communicating with the voters, but also as we work with. We don't. The issue was, if you don't remember, we don't know exactly what monies we may get from the feds, and if any. And so we wanted to have some flexibility in there as what that amount might be, assuming, of course, it's a $60 million hole. Hopefully it will be smaller. But we just don't know what that difference will be. So I think this language gives us that flexibility without essentially saying that we're going to fund the entire amount up front, trying to get the feds to come to the table. So I appreciate everybody's work in getting that done.
And I would note, for those who are tracking that was on page 4 of the document. Okay, very good, very good. Anything else you want to add, Councilman McManus? All right, thank you for that. Any other questions, discussion related to that? And again, I'm prepared to hold it. I'm prepared to send it out, whatever the committee's pleasure is.
My preference, as one who's often asked to make the motions, is I'd like to vote it out today without an advance with this change, simply because we only have 2 weeks after we get back in January to finish things up, and I think it'd be best if it were in front of the council. That gives us, obviously the entire break to continue to have conversations about it. And I just think that if we hold it in committee until after, the time crunch will be a little too tight.
I don't disagree with that. Any thoughts, Councilman Barnes?
I thought that's the best bet.
All righty then. Well then, if that takes us through our discussion, I will ask for a committee recommendation then.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I move that committee substitute for ordinance number 170919 as amended be reported out of committee with a recommendation of due pass.
Second.
It has been moved and seconded that committee substitute for ordinance number 170919, including the item that was caught by Councilman McManus, be passed out of committee with a recommendation of due pass. Is there any discussion on that motion? Hearing none, all in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? We will hear this in January. Thank you all very much. And although I think, there's Councilman Ford and Sheila, thank you very much.